This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this.
Welcome back, everybody, to the X-Cast. As ever, the truth is in here. I am your host this week, Carl Sweeney, and thanks for joining me for this episode, which is all about demons. And joining me to discuss this episode is Clara Cook. Hey, Clara.
Hi, Carl.
How long has it been, Clara, since you and I X-casted together? It feels like a while.
It feels like, like half a year or a year? It's been a long time.
Yeah, well, we've been talking elsewhere about, ancient films, mainly. But yeah.
Yeah. Black and white films.
Yeah. Good to talk X-Files again. So, here we are for Demons, which aired on May the 11th, 1997, originally. It's an episode that was written by R.W. Goodwin, directed by Kim Manners. This is the penultimate episode of the 4th season of the X-Files. So, Clara, general thoughts on Demons, starting with a mark out of 10, please.
So, I really like Demons as an episode of the X-Files. I think that I've always liked it, and I think that I would give it a mark out of 10 of... Ooh, it's tough. I would think maybe 7 or 8.
Okay. So why, if you've always liked this one, tell me what it is that appeals to you about it.
Well, so, one, I like the way it's filmed. I like the effects of the flashbacks. I think they're really, really artistic and effective. I like the idea of people desperately trying to regain their memories and doing anything to regain their memories. I like how it sort of ties in nicely with Gethsemane in the sense that it makes Mulder appear even more desperate. And I would say, willing to take very dangerous risks and sort of, in a way, sort of harm himself. It makes all the events of the finale seem a little bit more realistic and tie in more of his character. And I like the sort of Mulder and Scully moments in the episode. I like how we don't actually, I like the format of somebody waking up and thinking they may have done something terrible, but not sure how or why. So the mystery is sort of solved in reverse, the events are kind of solved in reverse, we're retracing Mulder's steps to find out what happened. I like the way it's told, basically.
Yeah, so my mark out of 10, drum roll, is 8 out of 10 as well. I like this one quite a bit too. I think there's a very, very strong core to this episode, centred around Mulder's impossible pursuit, as it's dubbed later in the episode. So, as a character piece, yeah, I think it's a very strong instalment. Tonally, I think it hits the mark. The reason I think it's an 8 out of 10 and not higher is I think there's a casualness to some of the plotting that maybe holds it back a little. Some elements here which are a bit implausible or I would have liked to see developed slightly further. So I guess in some ways it maybe depends where your interests lie. I think the people who really like this one seem to praise it specifically as a character study. So yeah, I think that for what it suggests about Mulder's trauma and his response to it, it's a very worthwhile episode. Ultimately, I guess I'm willing to overlook the things here that don't quite work, and I think there are some of them, because there are some very powerful ideas in Demons that they work through in a very satisfying, visceral manner, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. I think the problems that I have with it aren't actually to do with the way the episode's made, or the way the episode's written. The problems I have to do with it are just Mulder's decisions, but I think that's my feeling about the characters rather than the episode itself, if that makes sense. I feel like he's quite irresponsible.
Yeah, but isn't that dramatically... Well, this is the debate about Demons. This is the debate about Demons, I think, that you hear from some people that, some people say it's the wrong episode at the wrong time. So there's a book by a guy called Robert Shearman who wrote a book, Wanting to Believe, it goes through all the episodes.
Yeah.
This is the kind of thing he says too. So I guess what the argument is putting this episode smack bang in the middle of the cancer storyline exacerbates that sense that you're talking about of Mulder being an irresponsible person. Is that kind of what you mean?
Yeah, although I actually think that ties in with who he is as a person, actually. I think actually it makes sense. But it doesn't mean that I like it. As a audience member, as a viewer, I'm like, you're really making some stupid decisions here. And I guess that's what I don't like about it. But I actually think that it's quite accurate with his personality.
Yeah, I think some of the other reviews I've seen, so Darren Mooney also says it's awkwardly placed. Is it fair to say, so I guess what some of these guys would say is it's one thing for a standalone episode to ignore the cancer storyline. So we've had episodes like Caddish in season 4, or Small Potatoes. But this is an episode that's concerned with aspects of the mythology, and you wouldn't know from it. You just watch this episode in isolation about the cancer storyline, and you might find it a bit odd. So do you think there's something to that?
Yeah, I think that the problem is that they don't mention the cancer at any point during this episode. I think if they did, it would fit in much better. But I think Mulder's decision to go off and do something rash and to be desperate at a time when Scully's like deathly ill, I think is pretty accurate a reaction. I think he's more desperate about finding what happened to his sister now because he knows he's about to lose his partner. And obviously I'm reading into it because that isn't written into the episode. So maybe it should be more explicitly stated in the episode that he's becoming more extreme as the stakes get higher for Scully. I think that when there's something wrong with Scully, he does tend to get self-destructive, Mulder. He starts to take risks. I mean, he did climb onto in Ascension, he did climb onto like an airborne, I can't remember what it's called, like cable car. I don't think him becoming more foolhardy or risky or more depressed is something that actually is a surprise when Scully's involved. But I agree with you. It's the cancer isn't mentioned at all. And Scully might have mentioned it, like as in, why did you choose to do this at a time in which I really need you to be healthy and not to be doing anything dangerous because I'm battling life-threatening terminal cancer?
Yeah.
But she's not going to ever say that kind of thing to Mulder anyway, though, is she?
No, well, I don't agree that this is the wrong episode at the wrong time. But I think that with some alterations, you could have put this episode anywhere in the 3rd, 4th, or 5th seasons, essentially. And you're right, it does kind of tie into, or it kind of foreshadows what's going to happen in Gethsemane. But I think the real core is the Samantha stuff here. And I think you could have done that at any time after Paperclip, before the LA years, really, where the Samantha storyline kind of fades away until One Son, I suppose, and stuff like that, and ultimately Sign and Sight and Closure, of course. Yeah, so some of the trivia on this one, I guess R.W. Goodwin is the writer, had directed, some of the best episodes of the series previously. I think what happened here is that Carter needed a script, had been asking Goodwin for a while to write one, and so it came to pass. He was inspired, supposedly, he read an essay by the neurologist Oliver Sacks, which was about a man who could recall every detail of his childhood, which is kind of an interesting idea, isn't it? So, ended up with this story in which Mulder wakes up in a strange place with no idea how he got there. Apparently, and I can't speak to this, I'm not an expert on this, but apparently, Goodwin was aware of how implausible this idea was of the therapy and so on, and he said he took some significant creative liberties with what's going on here. So I don't know, should that kind of thing bother us, do you think?
I don't think it bothers me particularly with this episode, partly because it's quite clear that the doctor is doing something illegal and immoral. I think if it was presented as a legitimate way for people to retrieve their memories, then I might have more of a problem. But it's quite clear that the doctor is basically just, experimenting on them. So I think the episode actually does quite a good job of presenting mental illness, actually. And I think and the destruction it wreaks upon people's lives. And I think it also shows how desperate people will turn to any sort of doctor or sort of unproven science in order to be able to resolve their demons or resolve their problems. So I actually think that the doctor's portrayed as basically being a quack. So I think that's fine.
Yeah, I think my litmus test is normally, would a reasonable viewer either, imitate this or come away from the episode and give credence to this. And I don't think you really can from Demons. So
No.
I think that's fair to say. All right, so on IMDb, would you care to hazard a guess, Clara, as to the rating this has on IMDb from viewers? 2,310 viewers have rated this episode.
Well, knowing how fans get angry at Mulder whenever he does something that isn't very kind to Scully, I think just that alone would mean that people would rate the episode lower. So I think I would say maybe 5 or 6.
You're considerably out, actually.
Oh, really?
It's 8.2 out of 10.
Oh, I was so pleased. Well done, X-Files fans.
But yeah, the follow-up, though, is if you line up all the episodes top to bottom based on IMDb ratings, how highly do you think this one comes? Like, do you think this is a popular episode amongst the fans? How highly do you think it rates?
Well, compared to all other X-Files episodes,
No, just in season 4.
Just in season 4.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay, that's all right. Well, I won't tease you any longer. It's 15th for the season, which seems a little low to me, but there are a lot of good episodes in season 4, to be fair. So
There's some good monsters of the week, right? So those are always really popular.
yeah. Okay, Clara, let's get further into this one. Let's dig deep into Demons. So we get like a pulsing orange light, I guess I would describe it as, which gives way to Samantha, young Samantha Mulder. This film stock we see is very grainy. So interestingly, I thought we see adult Fox Mulder with young Samantha, as we also did in Herrenvolk with the clone, and as we do in the dream sequence in Paper Hearts this season. So we hear some voices. We hear a woman saying she's my child. We do see young Fox in the mirror. So basically the scene is Mr. and Mrs. Mulder arguing, Samantha's afraid, and then the camera moves into Mulder's eye, and we're back to a sweating Mulder in the present day, waking up on the floor of a motel room, and his shirt is bloody. So he calls Scully, of course. Mulder thinks he's in Rhode Island. He's got the room key, but he doesn't think it's his blood. So yeah, what did you make of this beginning to the episode?
I mean, I think it's a great teaser. I love the idea of an X-Files episode starting with a memory, and the flashbacks are really well done. I like especially like the flashing, like light effect. It makes me think of a bulb, on a camera, basically like a flash, like going off. And I like how like the sort of scenes are slightly disjointed. It's like a flash, and then he's sort of moving in the flash, and then there's another image. It's clever of them to make it older Mulder rather than Mulder as a kid, because then you immediately know it's Mulder. Otherwise, if it was a kid, you'd be like, what's going on? You might know it's Samantha, but you wouldn't be completely clear. And I think that it's a classic to start a story with the hero waking up not knowing where he is and what he's done, and he's covered in blood. Like, it's a good way of creating a mystery. Mm-hmm. And I think we'd all know that Mulder didn't really kill somebody, and so there isn't as much threat there as there could be. But I guess the audience is concerned about Mulder because he's obviously in a desperate situation but doesn't know how he got there. They do make David Duchovny really sweaty, though. Like, every time I see this episode, I'm like, ugh. He's so sweaty.
Yeah. I suppose it sets up a nice puzzle, doesn't it, this sequence? But look at those flashbacks. So several, they use different techniques to give effect to that, to give it this uneasy feel. And I think this is one of my favourite aspects of the episode, are these flashbacks. I think it's a great way to deal with this issue of trauma. So I had a look at this quote from a book called Unclaimed Experience by a woman called Cathy, where she says, "Trauma is not locatable in the simple violent or original event in an individual's past, but rather in the way that its very unassimilated nature, the way it was precisely not known in the first instance, returns to haunt the survivor later on." And that's what this episode gets exactly right, I think. Because Mulder's got these, like, irreconcilable gaps in his knowledge. These almost unimaginable things that his parents have been involved with. And I think, the knowledge of Samantha's disappearance has always haunted him. We've known that since the pilot. When he recovered the memories of her abduction through therapy, that only intensified, So he's always known it since childhood, and then he has these therapy sessions later on. And then during the course of the series, as it's worn on, all these things he's uncovered have just become more disturbing, more troubling, more shocking, So I think what I'm saying is the visual representation of these flashbacks, I think, suits the haunting nature of these memories, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And the sound as well, like the sort of the way that his parents' voices kind of sort of come in and out. It's quite intrusive, you know. It's like, like he's sort of inadvertently hearing parts of their argument, and there is something kind of frightening about. I mean, well, we'll go on to talk about it, but as the flashbacks become more frequent, what he's actually witnessing is violence, really, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think why I like it so much, though, is that I think the thing with trauma is that a lot of people feel that it's basically unrepresentable. A lot of people would say it's like something like grief or like hunger. So you can imply it, you can suggest it, you can approximate it, but you can't convey it exactly. But, you know, film and TV, it does have these specific ways that you can get quite close to conveying it. And it's principally through flashback sequences, you know, that take you back and forth through time. And I think that, you know, flashbacks as a term, the funny thing is it's used in psychoanalysis, but the term was actually used as early as the 1910s in relation to film. So people were talking about flashbacks in relation to film in a way that predates its use in psychoanalysis, in other words. And the way it's done here I really like, because, you know, you can do flashbacks in a bunch of different ways to do different things. But what normally would mark it out as being to be taken at face value is when they're clear and when they're coherent and when they're integrated into a story in a fashion that's not disruptive. And here they're anything but, aren't they? They come on very suddenly. They're very intense. They're chaotic. They're fragmented. And so I'd say that I think it's a very appropriate way to dramatise these terrible events in a way that leaves us not quite sure about the veracity of what we're watching. And I think if you read about what a lot of people say about this episode, there are these question marks about, you know, the truth at the heart of the matter, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and there's something kind of awful about that, like not being able to trust your own memory or to trust, like, the visions that you're seeing. I mean, he's essentially having memories that are coupled by seizures, isn't he? And it's that, I mean, a seizure alone is frightening as it is, like, without having to be coupled with a flashback. So there is, I mean, as well as the whole theme of mental illness, there's also this really upsetting thing about, really disturbing idea of not being able to trust your own memory, or, you know, do you think what you think, like, do you know what you know, like, as in, like, what is what you know real? Like, what are you remembering something that's true, or are you actually going crazy?
Yeah, and even, like, when he has this gap in his memory, like, am I capable of the things that the evidence seems to be pointing, you know, suggesting that I have done, you know? So what happens is Scully drives in, you know, we get this very strident score from Mark Snow. Apparently, if you look at the date stamps on the episode, she makes it to where Mulder is in, like, record time, I think. So, yeah, she enters the motel room. Mulder's sitting under that running shower in a state of shock. Doesn't remember anything, doesn't know what day it is. The last thing he can clearly remember happened a couple of days previous to this, and a couple of rounds fired from his gun, which further intensifies that element of mystery that you've mentioned as well. So Scully's, you know, basically thinking he's had a serious cerebral event, but Mulder needs to know what happened, and that sets up, you know, a lot of the interplay that's going to drive the drama forward. And Mulder's got these keys with the word Amy on. So you've mentioned the puzzle and the mystery and so on. So do you have any qualms about the use of amnesia here? Because it's a common device that's used in film and TV, isn't it? What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, amnesia is used a lot in television and film. In order to avoid it being cliched, you have to use it cleverly. Like, I would think about, like, the film Memento used amnesia really cleverly, you know, in a way that was original and new. I wouldn't say that the amnesia here is used in traditionally, well, in a very original way. I would say it's used in a very traditional way. I would say what makes it interesting is that we haven't seen Mulder have flashbacks like this before, really, have we? I mean, obviously he had that hypnosis episode or period where he was being treated by a hypnotist, I guess you'd call them, or whatever, to recall memories. But we've never seen him have, like, sort of uncontrollable flashbacks. And this is kind of the beginning of, like, the whole Mulder's brain sort of theme, isn't it? Right? Because before this, we don't really have him having major brain issues or suffering from brain problems, but then his brain becomes a thing in later episodes and later seasons.
So you're thinking of the biogenesis.
Yeah, and I mean,
like
they haven't, obviously the writers didn't link this with that, but after a while, do you know what I mean? Like, basically Mulder's brain we keep being told how brilliant he is, right? How clever and smart he is. And then literally his brain becomes almost like a desirable object. So this is sort of like the beginning of that kind of theme. But it's not, I would say the amnesia isn't really treated. I didn't really think of it so much as amnesia. I thought more of it as, I guess it's drug-induced amnesia, maybe.
Well, later on it is linked to the ketamine, isn't it, specifically, I think?
Yeah.
Season 8, I think Mulder, when he's away, he's had this incurable brain disease, hasn't he? But it's one of the weaker plot points of season 8, I think.
Yeah.
Amnesia. So it's a classic plot device. I think, it is a traditional use of it. It was especially prevalent in 1940s American cinema, especially post-war, like the late 40s. So if people want to check out, I don't know, films like The Crooked Way, Somewhere in the Night. Not film noir, but Hitchcock's Spellbound is a great example, in which you have Gregory Peck's characters impersonating a man he thinks he could have killed. He just doesn't quite remember. So there is this lineage of amnesia stories. And I think this usage of it kind of fits into that sort of, it feels like a film noir plot at the outset of this one to me. But I think it's also kind of become associated with things like soap operas, and it's maybe acquired this reputation, amnesia, as being something of a cheap plot device too. It can actually happen, of course, in extreme cases. But I think it's easy to see why people utilise it as a way of exploring the loss of a protagonist's sense of identity. I think it does offer some real dramatic possibilities. So what about this issue of... Well, it turns out Mulder drove there. The steering wheel of the car he was driving, it wasn't his car, but the steering wheel is bloody. The car is registered to a local man, David Cassandra. So you were saying his refusal of medical advice, which he does over and over again in the episode. You're saying that kind of bugged you, just because he's so obstinate and stubborn?
Yeah, it seemed a bit strange. I think that exists purely to create tension between Scully and Mulder in the episode. It's her constantly saying you need medical treatment and him saying no, I don't. I think one of the clearest ways of finding out what happened would be to go to hospital and discover the hole in your head and that you had remnants of ketamine in your system. But then that would end the episode in half the time. So for plot devices, they have to continue on.
Isn't it also, though, that the more flashbacks he's having, the closer he feels he's getting to the truth? So presumably, if he went in for medical treatment, they'd do something that set him right, but it might take away the flashbacks, I think, is what he was kind of thinking.
Yeah. One of the main problems I had with this episode in terms of the amnesia, just thinking back to what you were saying, was that he doesn't remember the Cassandras. He doesn't remember what happened with the Cassandras. And I can understand that he may not remember the period where he was actually, high on ketamine. But he should remember contacting the Cassandras or speaking to the Cassandras to arrange a trip up there and stuff. It's like his whole memory is wiped from the moment he got in his car is at his apartment and drove to this location. And that seemed a bit unrealistic to me. He doesn't remember anything like that before,
Yeah, I think this is probably one of the things I was thinking when I said a casualness to the plotting, Then we get that scene, though, with the guy who's removing his own face from the photographs as the blood run down to his forehead. And I was wondering, a couple of things. I think first-time viewers, maybe you're seeing this guy's the villain. We're going to find out more about him. There's going to be some kind of supernatural phenomenon involved. But I was also thinking, does this scene kind of break the spell? Because what's interesting about those early scenes, I think, is there is this mystery. And it's quite fun to see them kind of puzzle it out. But then as soon as we depart from Mulder's POV, as it were, maybe that kind of undermines the drama a little bit. But I think you did need to see this guy first, because his second appearance is ultimately going to be his last. You need to kind of set him up, I suppose. Yeah,
and I think that I found that sort of sad more than frightening, actually. And I think it's supposed to be creepy and frightening. I guess it's kind of creepy, but in a way, they're sort of setting up, this guy's going to have some sort of, I don't know, desire to kill somebody, or he's going to be doing something supernatural. But actually, just to me, it looked like a person who was really suffering. And I kind of linked him cutting out his face from all those photos with the woman repeatedly painting the same house again and again, which just is really, really sad.
Yeah, which is the next scene when they go to the Cassandra house and they talk to the housekeeper. And Mulder notices the painting, which Mulder seems to, the house in the painting, Mulder seems to recognise, doesn't know how. And yeah, it's all she paints. So I guess her obsessive drive, I think it's supposed to suggest a kind of parallel with Mulder, isn't it, I think? At least that's how I took it.
Yeah, so I actually, at the end of the episode, I mean, Scully has an idea of how these people are, like, have come to be how they are, like, are suffering, and she has, like, a syndrome, doesn't she? But actually, I sort of, at the end of the episode, thought they might actually really be victims of this whole mythology, that maybe they really were abducted by aliens, and that maybe they're in a similar situation to Mulder, rather than Mulder sort of accidentally falling into a group of people who are severely mentally ill. But then you've got a question, is the trauma making them mentally ill, or being abducted by aliens kind of making you feel crazy? If that's the right way.
Yeah, so you mean when Scully mentions it's Waxman-Gershwin syndrome is what she refers to?
Yeah. So they leave it quite vague, don't they? Has Amy Cassandra been abducted by aliens? And that's why she's repeatedly painting this house where she may have been abducted. Or is Amy Cassandra actually someone who's suffering from a mental illness who thinks she's been abducted by aliens? They leave it open to interpretation so the audience can decide either way that they want to believe it. Because obviously we don't believe Mulder's suffering from mental illness. We know Mulder witnessed his sister be abducted by aliens. Like, we're supposed to believe that. Or at least believe that Mulder believes it.
Yeah, and it's been, Scully may not believe that, but it's been problematised as recently as Paper Hearts, but I think, the audience basically believes that. So Mulder's sure he's been to this house, which is 20 miles from where they're currently located, and it's a place quite near to where the Mulder's, Mulder's parents had this summer house in Quanakatog. So they go out there. The house is abandoned and overgrown. Mulder has another flashback, so he's kind of eavesdropping on his parents' argument. His father closes the door on him as young Mulder sees the cigarette-smoking man. Played again by Chris Owens in this episode. You're a little spy, is what he says. So, and we'll see him again, of course, in the flashbacks later on. Yeah, so when Mulder comes to, he doesn't remember what happened. He remembers the flashback. Says it felt very real to him. And I think that's what they link to the syndrome, isn't it? That these dreams you have in Waxman-Gershwin syndrome are very vivid and they feel real, I think is what they say later on. Scully says, it was kind of an electrical storm in the brain. So yeah, she does give a lot of medical advice in this episode, doesn't she? Yeah,
I actually find Scully diagnosing Mulder really humorous because, most of it's done without much evidence. So she's not like she's triaging him, like as in first aid or anything. She's just like she's a paramedic or something. She just sees the symptoms and then she rifles off a bunch of explanations. But they're doing that because they need the audience to consider these other medical possibilities. That this actually isn't Mulder having legitimate flashbacks. This might be that Mulder is having some sort of seizure or something. So they need to put doubt in the audience's mind. Like maybe he did lose his mind and kill somebody. Maybe he's actually having legitimate flashbacks. They're trying to keep the mystery open. I think the bit where the cigarette-smoking man says, "You're a little spy," I really love that because, I don't know, saying it is just something really, really sinister about it. It's more creepy than any monster, is that this stranger in your home who's just this sinister dark force who's upsetting and frightening your parents spots you, in the other room watching. There's just something really creepy about that.
Well, I suppose that's the thing about the flashbacks, isn't it? That if what emerges through Mulder's flashbacks is that the cigarette-smoking man is ultimately the nefarious evil behind everything, you could look at that as, is Mulder just kind of seeing what he wants to see? Because, that kind of absolves his own father and mother of a certain degree of complicity. And I like the way they play around with that in some of the imagery we see later, which we'll come on to. But yeah, in terms of Scully's role in this episode, I guess what I like about it is it may feel like Mulder doesn't listen to her much, in all these instances where he ignores what she says about we need to get to a hospital and so on. But at the end of the episode, what she says ultimately is very important, in that final scene. But yeah, they enter that house that Mulder thinks he's been in before, and they discover, ultimately, Scully discovers the dead woman on the floor, gunshot wound to the heart, and then the husband. So the first body is Amy Cassandra and her husband, so a second dead body. So it goes unsaid initially because I think they go to an act break, but yeah, I guess I don't know. I don't think many audience members are really thinking, could Mulder have done this? But then I don't think the episode is trying to milk that as much as it might have done either. So that doesn't bother me.
No, and I think it's like a little lonely scene, where they discover this couple both dead in this house. There's something kind of sad about it, but they're showing that there is a cost to this pursuit, this obsessive pursuit to try and remember what your mind has hidden from you, But yeah, I don't think at any point, I would say most audience members are not going to think that Mulder killed these people.
Yeah, I would go back to my prior point though. I think this sequence would have been a little more unnerving if we hadn't already seen the character of Physicus, the guy with the photographs, because I think that just would have added to the sense of Mulder and Scully, particularly Mulder, getting in over their heads. Maybe. Who knows? Scully basically refuses to believe Mulder had any part in it. Mulder's kind of basically saying, well, the evidence points directly to him. He refers to O.J. Simpson at one point. And then there's the actor playing the cop who turns up, who we'll see a bit in this episode, Jay Acavoni. Did you recognise him, Clara? I was going to say Scully then.
Yeah.
I was going to say, do you recognise him,
You
Scully?
can call me Scully, it's okay.
Yeah, no, do you recognise him? We've seen him else. Oh, we will go on to see him elsewhere in the X-Files.
Yeah, doesn't he play a bounty hunter at one point, or an alien? Or a hitman?
Well, next see him he plays Duffy Haskell in season 8, who's a guy who comes to Scully and Doggett in the episode Permanum, and we see him a couple more times after that, I think. I think at face value, when we first meet him as Duffy Haskell, he's sympathetic, and then that turns around the more we find out about him, I think. But yeah, still a few years away though. So he's not buying Mulder's story. He says they've got these fingerprints to examine and stuff. So Mulder goes off with a cop. Scully's going to go and examine the bodies and the forensic reports, I think. So she does the autopsy. Well, the other guy does the autopsy, I think, doesn't he? And it's a guy who we've also seen in Deep Throat. He played Colonel Budahas in Deep Throat, and he also played Agent Weiss in Colony and Endgame. So an X-Files regular. And yeah, good old Scully, isn't it? She notices something that was overlooked. It's the scab on Amy's head. She removes that, asks for more tests to be run. So yeah, it's a good job she was there.
Yeah, there's something kind of squirm-inducing about the idea of a hole in the head. So it's kind of pure X-Files, I think. This idea of like a hole being drilled into your brain. I did think it was funny that Mulder actually solves the crime, kind of. Like he gives an explanation for how the crime could have happened, essentially incriminating himself. He's like, I solved it, and basically I'm the murderer. But it's nice how Scully completely and utterly believes his innocence. Like, there's no question in her mind that he did not kill these people. And I'm like, yeah, go on, Scully.
Yeah, absolutely resolute and steadfast in her support for him, wasn't she? Which I thought was nice to see, definitely. There's that scene where the cop talks to Mulder back at the station, I think. The bag on the table, all that stuff. It looks like Mulder's gun is the murder weapon. 2 blood types on the shirt. Mulder can't explain how the blood got there. There's that interesting moment when they arrest him. Did you notice where Mulder kind of closes his eyes, and it's almost like he's trying to tune out his surroundings, as the camera moves in and the sound kind of drops down in the mix. And I suppose a comparison would be with something like Paper Hearts, where I think Paper Hearts gets quite close on first watch to making people believe that, this might be an alteration to the Samantha storyline. In this instance, I never felt, and I don't think I felt on first viewing, that the episode is going to follow through on all of these things. But again, I think the question becomes, what really happened? How does Mulder get out of it? So there's enough meat to the drama anyway, I think.
Yeah, I think that it's helped by the fact that the performances of the other people in the episode are really good. Like, for instance, Detective Curtis, the guy that plays Detective Curtis, I think he does a very convincing job of a detective. Like, he's not antagonistic, he doesn't dislike Mulder. It just seems like Mulder has actually killed these people. I mean, the evidence all points to Mulder. It's the most reasonable explanation.
Yeah.
And Mulder himself isn't, he's confused, obviously, but he's not exactly cooperative either, and he doesn't seem massively frightened, or he just seems kind of weary, really. And I wondered, I was like, well, maybe that's a hangover from the drugs and the flashbacks and everything. But, I mean, again and again in the series, you do see Mulder sort of rail against law enforcement. You know, he often pushes back, or I guess what he's doing is like rebelling against authority, which is part of his personality. But he does seem to rebel against law enforcement, which is funny considering he's actually law enforcement himself.
Yeah, well, it's like, how anti-establishment can an FBI agent really be? You know,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I did sympathise with Detective Curtis when he was like, I think your partner did this. And I was like, yeah, I would come to the same conclusion if I were him.
Yeah, if we didn't know Mulder and Scully, I think it's exactly right, yeah. But then Scully turns up with the new evidence, which is the ketamine in Amy's system. Yeah, ketamine, am I right in thinking that's like a recreational drug as well?
Yes, yeah, it is, yeah. I say that with such certainty, like I've taken it. I do not take ketamine. I've never taken ketamine.
Let us know, listeners. Yeah. So Scully doesn't know who administered it, but she points out, look, the strength of the drug alone could explain the memory loss and the blackouts, and it points to something dicey going on, essentially. So it goes back to what we said, that, you know, she's rock solid in her support for Mulder, which is nice to see. You know, you're jailing an innocent man. And then this next scene I wanted to talk about. So again, the looseness of the plotting. This is the key example. So it's the man we recognise from the scene before, who was cutting his face from the photos. We see him look at a photo of 3 women now with his face cut out. He pulls out a gun and shoots himself. So this is very convenient, isn't it? In terms of its placement in the episode, its proximity to the protagonists, and so on. Too convenient, I would say.
Yeah, it's very convenient. I mean, it's quite possible that this poor guy could just go home to his own apartment and shoot himself there, and then no one would know for quite a while, and Mulder would just probably sit in jail for a bit longer. But they need to resolve this plot in, like 50 minutes or something? So they need the guy to shoot himself a couple cells away from where Mulder's being held. And I did like how he shot himself, and then Scully kind of says, you know, I'm a doctor, let me through. Puts her fingers on his pulse, or looks at his head, says, get the paramedics, and then says, he's dead. And I'm like, that's a great emergency first aid there, Scully.
What? You're only saying that, haven't you just done a first aid course, Clara?
Yeah.
So
I was watching this, I was like, what would I do in this situation? But yeah, like, I do think that she's quite matter-of-fact about it.
Well, at least the follow-up scene then is when they examine his desk, and the cop talks about how this guy had become something of a joke. He began to believe in extraterrestrial, stuff like that. So yeah, I guess it is interesting to look at this episode in light of what we know is coming up in Gethsemane. Do you think... So like I said, I think you could basically do this episode somewhere else in the series, but do you think it's key that it comes just before Gethsemane?
Yeah, because I think we know that Mulder didn't kill these people, but Gethsemane was coming at a time when, you know, I think that people knew that the X-Files was going to be renewed for another season. But I do remember something that Sarah Blair, you know, the one of the producers of this podcast.
Yeah, the name rings a bell. Yeah.
I remember her saying to me that when she was younger and she was watching it, and the end of that episode, she was like, oh my God, maybe Mulder really did commit suicide. And you had to wait like the whole summer, or at least you had to wait months and months and months to find out, you know, whether or not he did or not. And she said it seemed quite like as if the show was really saying, because there was like rumours about how maybe David Duchovny wanted to leave the show, all that kind of thing. So, you know, it was almost like maybe the show runners and the writers actually did come up with this idea of killing off this character like this. And so you have to kind of believe that Mulder's desperate enough to be suicidal. And I actually think there's always something self-destructive about Mulder. It doesn't seem like such a stretch for him to become so desperate that he would harm himself. So it helps to just make Gethsemane a little bit more believable, I think.
Yeah, I don't think so, because I think Gethsemane kind of fluffs that aspect, to be honest. I agree. I think that is something you could do with Mulder, but I just don't think they do it well enough in Gethsemane. I think it's a very good episode that doesn't quite carry through that aspect well enough. But the guys along next week will dig into that a bit more. I still think the heart of this episode is the Samantha stuff, and I think you could relocate this episode and still deal with that. But yeah, if it does tee up Gethsemane on some level, great. Scully talks about the photos. about this, that this man was altering, speaks to a pronounced mental illness, reveals he was traumatized, which leads to, we see Amy Cassandra on a magazine cover, abductee. So Amy killed David Cassandra, then herself is what happened. Mulder was also on the scene, and some of those details are a little hazy. Like, how did Mulder get back to the motel, you know, in this extreme state of stress and so on. But I guess we just kind of have to accept that. We get another flashback from Mulder. Bill Mulder and CSM. Young Mulder goes upstairs. Mrs. Mulder says, "Not Samantha, not Samantha." And back in the present day, Mulder shouts for the guard. So, another way in which this episode is discussed is in terms of, like, the canonicity, if that's a word, of these flashbacks. Do you feel like what we see on screen can be easily reconciled with what we see, like, elsewhere in the series, or what we hear about?
Yeah, I don't think that's a problem. I think what's a problem is the fact that Mulder has these flashbacks. There's the possibility that cigarette-smoking man could be either Samantha's father or his father, but yet he doesn't seem to dwell on it forever after that, right? I mean, essentially...
After this episode,
yeah, I mean, essentially in season 11 of The X-Files, or season 10 even, he's battling his own father. He doesn't really mention him, does he? He doesn't really mention that he's actually... I mean, I guess at some point, Spender might say it at some point in, I think, season 9. Spender sort of talks about how they're half-brothers and cigarette-smoking man is Mulder's father, but Mulder's very quiet on the subject.
Do you blame him?
I mean, it's not something he likes, but it'd be nice to know that, like, you know, like, he's actually aware of it, like...
Yeah, I suppose the thing is that his relationship with his mother is essentially basically over after this episode. They don't speak as much after the events of Demons.
I mean, we have to discuss Mulder's mother a little bit. Like, she's basically prevaricating, you know, and he's quite ashamed at first to be asking her these questions. And then he starts to angrily accuse her. And interestingly, she never answers any of Mulder's questions. And actually, she doesn't answer any of Mulder's questions throughout the entire series, like from season 1 or whenever she first appears, all the way to the point where she dies. In fact, she actually decides to tell him something right before she kills herself, and then doesn't really ever tell him anything. And I think, like Scully's sort of saying, you know, she was trying to help you let go and be free, and, you know, that's great and everything, Teresa, or whatever your name is. But Tina, I think her name's Teresa. Yeah. Tina, I mean... Every time I see her do something like this in one of these scenes, like in the series, I have to scream at the television. I'm like, good God, woman, don't you care about your son? Because I sort of feel like she knows everything. She knows everything. She knows all the details. And she's just not saying anything. Either she's frightened, or she knows it's going to cause Mulder too much pain, or she's complicit.
Yeah, so I think Tina Mulder deserves considerable empathy, personally. Because I think she's clearly traumatized by everything that happened too. You know, and trauma can result in a repression of the past to the extent that, you know, the person has no recollection of the original trauma, or there may just be complete avoidance of thoughts about it. You know, so I think that when there are these times when she doesn't want to be drawn on things, I don't think she's just being evasive. You know, I think she's properly wounded by her experiences too. So, you know, I'm not saying, you know, she'd never win, like, Mother of the Year, but... I think that when you look at it through the lens of what happened to her, you know, she was hard done by, I think.
So she's just kind of blocked it all out, maybe.
Yeah. In terms of the canon issue, what I was thinking was this, that I think it's somewhat ambiguous whether what we're seeing is like a true representation, a vivid representation of authentic facts. But the Eat the Corn website, which is run by Kimon Karamidas, who's a great guy, his read of the episode is it all tallies up with what's established elsewhere, because we find out in Two Fathers, One Son that Bill Mulder had to give up a family member to the colonists to show he was committed. So the argument we see presumably is around that. The argument's in the Mulder summer house, although Samantha's taken from the main house, but the argument presumably happens a week or two or whenever before the actual abduction. So, like, did Bill Mulder find out about the affair on this night we're seeing in the flashbacks? You know, we don't know. Also,
to a certain extent, Mulder is really clutching at straws here when he goes and confronts his mother and says, you know, you had an affair with a cigarette-smoking man. But the flashback isn't showing anything romantic. The flashback is showing cigarette-smoking man, like, grabbing her either by the hair or by the back of the neck.
Which is quite
scared. Yeah, so what he's just showing is aggression and, like, manhandling. And that doesn't imply a relationship necessarily.
Yeah. By this point in the episode, Mulder is now thinking he didn't kill Amy and David, and Scully has enough evidence to prove it. We find out that Amy had been undergoing this kind of psychiatric care so she could recover her memories. This is where Scully talks about Waxman-Gershwin syndrome and so on. So it looks like Mulder's in the clear, but of course, what I thought rang very true is, he still wants to know why he was there. He still wants to get to the heart of the matter.
Yeah, and when they go to visit the doctor, Dr. Goldstein, there is a really wonderful little moment where Dr. Goldstein sort of says, please sit down, and neither of them sit down. And I noticed that, and you can just tell they both don't believe him from the moment they walk into that doctor's office. So they're quite good at reading people, I think, both of them. They know immediately this guy is dodgy.
Yeah, and, the doctor becomes very indignant, doesn't he, when he feels like his reputation's being challenged. But Scully's just great, isn't she? Because she, fixes him with that look, and it's like, I know what you do. Is it a bit late to be introducing him? I mean, I don't think it is if the actor's going to, blow our socks off, but I don't think the people who love demons are really talking much about Dr. Goldstein. I think he's an adequate character for the purposes of what they do here. I
think they should have made him more villainous. I think the problem is that he just acts like he doesn't care, but he acts really casual about it. So when she confronts him later at the end of the episode, he seems a bit casual about the whole thing, especially about the treatment. And it just seems like a very strange way to be after you've essentially killed 3 people. I think he should either seem more frightened and more emotional about it and panicked, or he should just be more villainous.
Like a madman. And he mentioned something in that scene about his aggressive method of treatment, simulating an electrical impulse, which presumably is the drill, which we see later. They do have an exchange, don't they, Mulder and Scully, where it's like, why would you do this, Mulder? Why would you undergo something as crazy and dangerous as this? That's when Mulder has that vision of his mother and the CSM together, which leads to that confrontation that we've already kind of touched on. So that confrontation, at first he's unable or unwilling to look her in the eyes, and then they go in, which is kind of an interesting way to play it. Then they go into the other room and they have the one-on-one. Kind of awkward for Scully, I think, when Mrs. Mulder goes upstairs, Mulder drives off. It makes you wonder what happens next.
Yeah, I actually think him seeming kind of ashamed and unable to look his mother in the eye is brilliant, actually. Just goes to show that even adults sort of, go back to being children in front of their parents. And she's quite a stern woman, so I could see her chastising her son, even though he's an adult. I think the sad thing about it is how happy she is to see him when he first walks through the door. She's delighted to see him, and then, you didn't tell me you were coming, and not knowing that he's coming to basically accuse her. But yeah, it is kind of awkward. Scully does look really awkward when she's left alone with Mulder's mother. But I think Scully has a sort of awkward relationship with Mulder's mother anyway. I personally think Scully feels the same way as me. I haven't had much evidence for that, but I think Scully's like, listen, woman, your son is in pain.
No, I think most people agree with you about Tina Mulder. She gets, she gets a fair share of criticism, I think, from the fan
I think
base.
It's hard because she's obviously going to be compared against the other mothers in the series, and the main other mother in the series is Scully's mother, who's the complete opposite.
Well, it's interesting that you mention about, that almost childlike thing of Mulder not being able to look in her eyes, because I think there is something very primal about all this, because I think what Freud claimed that repression is the cost we pay for maintaining social order. So, too much repression, he felt, could lead to intense rage and destruction. And you can see that here, I think, in a very powerful way, that once these horrible things start to come back into the open, the stability of the relationship between Mulder and his mother. And yeah, more recently, it's been characterised by care and sympathy, after she's had the stroke and so on. They have a nice little exchange of paper hearts, but all that's violently torn away. She slaps him, he bleeds. And I think that's a very sad thing. I think no matter what the extent of Tina Mulder's complicity was, it's very sad. And yeah, again, I do feel for her.
Yeah. No, I think she's definitely been a victim of abuse and trauma. But I also think that, yeah, I don't know. I think her adult son is on a life-altering quest that he may never, ever, ever reach the end of to find his beloved sister. His whole life is shaped around this quest. as Scully later on says at the end of the episode. So, and it is driving him to madness now. It's driving him towards destruction. I think now is the time to put aside your fear and trauma and try and like she doesn't, I guess the writers don't want her to do that because it's a similar thing that actually happens with multiple characters in the X-Files. They have the information, but for whatever reasons that we never find out, they withhold information again and again repeatedly because they have to drip feed it to Mulder and Scully. Otherwise, the entire series would be over in like one season.
Yeah, well, they become narrative obstacles, I think, which can be very effective. So, like, Bill Mulder goes into the bathroom and gets killed by Krychek. But it can also be very infuriating, the kind of Jeremiah Smith stuff where they drive across Canada and they don't get the answers. But yeah, Mulder wants Dr. Goldstein to finish the job. So, I want to remember. We go into more flashbacks. Mulder in the chair. We see lots of images. Many of them we've seen earlier. We also get this glimpse of the shaking board game tiles from Samantha's abduction and some more images from that night. This is where Dr. Goldstein pulls out the drill, which he's going to use on Mulder's forehead. Yeah, then the police descend, don't they, on the office to arrest him. Mulder isn't there. Where's he gone? This is the scene you talked about, I think. Goldstein driven away. What did you do to him? He said he was going to exercise his demons. So yeah, how well do you think all this kind of puts the pieces in place for the end game of the episode, which is coming up?
I mean, at one point Scully says something to him like, this is the only place he would have come, which I didn't think was true. I was like, well, he could have gone back to the summer house. He could have gone back to the Cassandra's house. He could have gone back to the hotel room. But I think she knows that Mulder's at this point where he just has to bring this to a conclusion. He has to find out. And he believes, like he sort of says, the truth is in my head or whatever. Maybe that's why she assumes he's gone there. I did wonder at the very end how Mulder's able to be an FBI agent after all of this. I hope they give him a period of sick leave because, should he really be trusted with a gun? Is there going to be an inquiry? I was thinking about the safety of all of this. I was like, he's essentially, literally lost it and he's got a gun. And she does write quite a damning report. Which makes him sound like he's on an insane quest that will end up leading to destruction and death. So I was a little confused as to how he's going to be back in the job in the next episode.
Well, again, this is the perennial thing, isn't it, with this kind of drama at this point in time in sort of TV history, where
episodic.
In real life, you'd need a long period of convalescence or whatever, but I think we just kind of accepted it back in the day, didn't we?
Does it bother you that you never find out what happened to the Cassandras? I think I just imagined that Amy Cassandra probably started hallucinating or like having flashbacks in a similar way that Mulder does in the second to last scene, where he's got his gun and he's going to shoot himself and Scully's trying to prevent him from shooting himself.
I would assume that because her surname is Cassandra, I would assume that she's basically on the level, because I think it's obviously a nod to the Greek prophet, isn't it? Cursed to see the future, but doomed to be ignored. So, I think that I would take, her versions of her experiences kind of at face value, just based on that. I think that must be why they chose that name. Yeah, what about that final sequence then? So, Quanakatog, summer house. Scully goes in, walks in on Mulder, who wants to be left alone, but another flashback of CSM and Samantha embracing, abduction night, the little green men stuff. It's all fallen into place, Mulder holding the gun. Some surreal imagery in there too, wasn't there? Like, did you see Samantha's image in the pane of glass, which shatters, giving way to that slow-mo shot of the smoking man? So it's getting kind of more abstract. Samantha falling into a black void as well. Scully is pivotal because she says, this is not the way to the truth, Mulder, you've got to trust me. Sound of gunshots, but it turns out he didn't shoot Scully, he was just kind of firing off the rounds. So, what did you make of this? Did you believe he was going to shoot Scully? How did you feel during this scene? How do you feel about the way they did it?
I didn't think he was going to shoot Scully. And I actually thought that maybe he wasn't facing her because she's suddenly behind him. Or I thought that they sort of filmed it to make it look like she was facing him just to add threat to the scene. But actually she's standing behind him and trying to prevent him from shooting himself rather than shooting her. I guess in a way the audience might think that he could shoot her because it's clear that, well, they make it out that Amy Cassandra shot her husband and then shot herself. So we know that somebody under the influence of this doctor's treatment could be harming other people as well as themselves. But I think, for me, the real threat was that he was going to harm himself. I think I actually believe that everybody in this episode had been, like everyone who was seeking the treatment and trying to recover their memories, I actually believe that all of them had somehow been abducted by aliens or a part of the mythology. And I actually think that this is a brilliant, if they'd done it more overtly, they made it more clear that was the case, this is a brilliant way to really hammer home how villainous this whole conspiracy is. Because you have the women who've been abducted and had their, reproductive, abilities taken away from them. But also to add this as well, that actually people are losing their minds in different parts of the US in an attempt to deal with this. Because Dwayne Barry has flashbacks and Dwayne Barry is obviously suffering. Mm-hmm. And I think that makes the Syndicate seem even more villainous in later episodes. You think, God, you're such assholes. If I can say that on the episode.
Yeah. So I think that it kind of reminded me just a little of that climax in Pusher.
I mean, isn't there an episode where Scully pulls a gun on Mulder? Is it Wet Wired or...
And Wet Wired, yeah, too. That's true, yep.
Both scenes were shot in semi-darkness and,
Both penultimate episodes of their respective seasons, yeah. So we end with the Scully voiceover. Mulder's been cleared of wrongdoing, has no recollection of the deaths, seizures subsided, no evidence of permanent damage, but Scully is concerned they'll have a lasting effect. And, fears Mulder may lose his course, may be driven forward in impossible pursuit of the truth.
Yeah, I'm hoping this is her diary and not a report for Skinner.
Yeah, it's kind of... I'd forgotten the episode ended with a voiceover, actually, because they kind of get phased out. We don't see that many of them after this, I don't think. So, yeah, interesting. All right, Clara, so should we see what the Xcast listeners made of this episode in our mailbag?
Yes, indeed.
All right, so yeah, we had some good responses here. Mixed. Some people very positive, some people less convinced, and a couple of long ones here too, which will be nice to get into. So the first one from Caredwen Foley says, Demons is a wonderful penultimate episode for Season 4. In a year where Mulder and Scully have been knocked off their axis, the season takes a natural step to invert things further and make them yet more uncomfortable. Mulder is both subject and object here, the target of the investigation instead of its lead, but he also has to turn his own investigation inward instead of outward because the mysteries are in his own memory. Scully is still brilliant doctor, kick-ass cop, devoted friend, and steadfast stoic, but she's also effectively both Mulder's lawyer and in a way his inquisitor. We heard that the truth was in her in Memento Mori, here it's in him. Demons is also a sublime bridge from Elegy to Gethsemane. In Elegy we get a glimpse of Mulder's hostility to Scully's stoicism, justifiable frustration that verges into unfair selfishness, and in Gethsemane he'll be presented with an explanation of the conspiracy that entirely undoes his worldview. It makes sense that trapped by Scully's deteriorating health, he would retreat into a familiar pursuit, but in a new, reckless, self-destructive way, and the surrealism of the episode, the sense that answering questions leads only to more questions, sets Gethsemane up to swipe all the pieces off the board and set up a totally different game. With the stakes as high as ever, Mulder is more emotionally fragile than he's been at any time since One Breath, so he courts disaster in the pursuit of control. It's heartbreaking and infuriating and pitch perfect.
Well, I would agree with her that this is actually a very realistic reaction on Mulder's part, to the idea that things are sort of starting to spiral beyond his control, and that he can't cure Scully, and that, obviously in Gethsemane, he has to confront the possibility that the conspiracy is a lie, and that Scully's actually sick because of him, indirectly or even directly, actually. So I agree with her on that. I think that his actions are become more wild because of that. I think this episode ties in quite nicely. I don't think it actually is placed in a bad place. I think that she's kind of got a point about how it sort of shows a sort of natural progression of Mulder's personality towards the end of the season and into the next one.
Colleen Costello said, I think it is one of the strongest episodes of Season 4. I didn't think much of it when I first saw it, but going back and seeing it again and again, the details in the storyline are important and profound. Michael Little says, one of my favourites of Season 4. A great character study of how far Mulder is willing to go to find his sister, Very underrated and deeply misunderstood. Both Gillian and David in top form. What I love about the last 4 episodes of season 4 is how things seem to be spiralling out of control for both Mulder and Scully. Another tour de force performance by David, and this version of Scully is probably my favourite. Concerned, medical, and a great investigator.
Yeah, I would argue that Scully doesn't have to do a huge amount different than what she would normally do in terms of acting. Well, Gillian Anderson doesn't have to do something different than what she normally has to do. But I felt like the first few scenes after the teaser were really well done. Like how she's quite calm but also concerned. She's checking everything and making sure, like checking his gun, checking his like pupils and stuff. And I thought his reaction to being in shock was quite realistic. Like David Duchovny's acting of like being completely and utterly bewildered and confused. Like it's very realistic, I think.
Yeah, I think everything when she's all these scenes where she's Mulder's advocate, she's very good in, I think. Karen McKenna said, Demons is one of my all-time favourite episodes. It starts off with one of the best teasers in the show's history and keeps up the momentum throughout. Mulder's reckless desperation for answers is both frustrating and heartbreaking, and Scully is the best damn friend anyone could ask for. Being woken up at the crack of dawn on a Sunday morning so she can drive like 7.5 hours to make sure that her partner, who may or may not have just killed someone, is okay. And despite this, and despite her own medical issues which must be weighing on her, she shows him nothing but concern and compassion and will kick the ass of anyone who seeks to bring him harm. I also love the style and substance of Mulder's flashbacks and what implications they may have. I love the confrontation between Mulder and his mother and how it relates back not just to his flashbacks but what he learned in Talifakumi. The episode is just so well written and directed, and the ending is another one of the best in the series, highlighting the bond between Mulder and Scully and everything it can endure. Just love it. So yeah, I guess by the ending she means the exchange, this isn't the way to the truth, Mulder. And I agree, I think that's a powerful idea, and it's well delivered, I think. Yeah,
I think so. I think that, I guess it sort of sets up this question of, like, what else is Mulder willing to do to find the truth? I mean, he's tried invasive brain surgery and, ketamine. Like, you do sort of feel like he's going to be willing to do a hell of a lot more.
All right, so Tony Black says, always liked this one. It's a funny little episode. Another one that in our modern era of serialization would likely form the basis of a much larger arc, all squeezed here into an amnesia standalone, a classic genre trope, which they use as a way to try and peek into the familial mythology of the Mulder homestead, plus remind viewers about the Samantha quest. Is it canonical? Well, who knows? The fact it adds more questions, I think, works to its strengths, perhaps an underrated curio. So I guess by is it canonical, I guess what he means is what happens in the flashback real? Obviously everything else is canon, isn't it? This whole thing happened, Mulder woke up and so on, and,
Yeah, although I guess why do we question if it's canonical or not? I guess we question it because Scully has this medical explanation as to why he's experiencing these flashbacks, because also he's taken a drug which can alter your memories and your mind, but also because it's implied that this procedure isn't the way to the truth, which implies some of the stuff that he's witnessing isn't actually the truth. So I guess that, like Tony's right, that does kind of make you question whether or not it's canonical, but then a lot of it later on does prove to be true. So
and the visual style, I think, would suggest it's kind of open to interpretation, or it may not be, Yeah. All right, so Jeremy Daniels says, surprised to see so many very positive comments here. By no means do I think it's bad, but I've always seen it, much like Wet Wired, which has the same place in the sequence of the season, to be middle of the road at best. It's a good little episode that we know isn't going to have the consequences it wants us to think it does, and I think that, again, might have a lot to do with its placement in the run. So it's interesting that he's kind of making the opposite point. It doesn't benefit from its placement before Gethsemane. It might benefit from being further away from that. So yeah, interesting alternative take. Yeah.
Yeah, and he's also got that. He also is right in the sense that he says that it's not going to have the consequences that the episode wants us to think it will. Like, it's true, they are going to revisit this again. So he's right about that.
Just a couple more. So Chandru Ravindran said, a powerful episode with some major flaws. It's a super dark character piece, maybe the darkest the show would get in the first 4 seasons, and it feels almost downright apocalyptic. Duchovny is in top form, and Gillian Anderson is great as well with her dogged faith in Mulder. Demons also has one hell of a scene where Mulder confronts his mother. Who is my father? Is a jaw-dropper of a line. Oh, and that score. My goodness, that score is incredible. They reuse bits of it in the 3 part to come, and it suits the grim mood beautifully. My major issue with this episode is the case is broken because, coincidentally, a cop in the same station Mulder is held kills himself and was treated by the same doctor as Mulder. It's far too convenient. The other issue is that by the show not being serialised, this character arc for Mulder feels like it ends a bit abruptly, though thematically it fits with Scully's cancer arc and his suicide arc in Gethsemane.
Yeah, I think that it is awfully convenient that the cop shoots himself in the same police station. And a lot of the evidence that Scully claims will exonerate Mulder isn't evidence that I would consider valid in exonerating him. It's only really later on when she manages to link the 3 together, and she sort of, and I think when she finds the doctor and all that sort of thing, before she's like, well, he has ketamine in his system, and the detective's like, well, I'm not sure that's a reason for like him being innocent. Like, I don't think that's going to exonerate him. I mean, they all could have gone and like, I don't know, taken ketamine together, and then he could have killed them. Yeah. So until the cop sort of shoots himself, I feel like she's kind of clutching at straws.
All right. The last comment is from Winston Pear. I guess we're ending on a downer, actually, because he says, this one has never really worked for me, which is a shame. I think it has everything to do with the very obvious and poorly done trickery of did Mulder shoot Scully. This bothers me even more by the fact it was done like 2 episodes back in Zero Sum. I would argue better when Skinner has a shooting CSM fake out. It was too soon to go for that gimmick again. Not sure who directed here, but in the case of Demons it felt like cheap TV. Yeah, it was Kim Manners directed. Paired with the fact nothing new is actually revealed, and I consider this one pretty darn minor. I'm kind of in between, so we started out with Caredwen and Colleen, who were like really, really positive, and I'm probably a bit closer to them than I am to Winston. But yeah, I think 8 out of 10 is what we said, wasn't it? You said 7 or 8. I said 8. I think it's a lot to recommend in Demons. Is it minor? Is that a fair word to use in conjunction with it?
I don't think it's minor, but I think the episode could have had more impact if, there was some sort of fallout afterwards. Like what Tony was saying, if it was done now, there would have been episodes afterwards that would have dealt with it and dealt with the sort of implications and the consequences of, the sort of treatment Mulder had and the memories he had and everything. But the fact that it's not referred to again, really, except maybe occasionally, like, sort of implied when Mulder's brain becomes a narrative device. I sort of feel a little bit like that makes the episode more minor than it really needs to be. That makes sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. This one has risen in my estimation over the years, I think. I used to think it was more minor than I do now. I think that there is a real power here to some of the stuff we see. So I do think there is a lot to recommend about Demons. But anyway, yeah, so Clara, what are you up to online? Where can we find you if we want to find out more about you?
So you can find me on Twitter at ClaraJeanMC. And you can also find my own podcast, The Tales We Tell, which is a podcast about sort of examining women and gender in film, television and fiction. And you can find that on Twitter at The Tales Podcast.
Yeah, and if you do want to hear more of myself and Clara, we've teamed up on my podcast a fair few times too, which is The Movie Palace, which is a podcast all about classic Hollywood and British cinema. So, yeah, come and track us down there if you like old westerns and stuff. It's the place to be. All right. Yeah, that's it for today, guys, on the Xcast Vote. So until next time, always remember, trust no one.
The Xcast, an X-Files podcast, is produced and hosted by Tony Black, alongside a dedicated team of podcasters and X-Files fans. You can find the show on Twitter at the X_cast, on Facebook by typing in the Xcast, or inside our group, the X-Files Basement, an Xcast podcast fan group, plus on Instagram by typing in the XFcast. If you're a fan of the show, why not support us on Patreon? Exclusive bonus episodes, early access to new episodes, plus become part of our Xcast community in the Patreon department. To see our monthly subscription options, just head to patreon.com/the Xcast. That's patreon.com/the Xcast. We'd love to see you join our Patreon community. We're also part of the We Made This podcast network at We Made This Pod on Twitter and We Made This on Facebook. You can find a range of shows on TV, film, music and popular culture in general on the network. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.